As I record these words, I'm preparing to go to Rome for the canonization of Saint John Henry Newman. Very excited about that. And then after the canonization, I'm going to Oxford to give a paper on Newman and evangelization. So the great English convert has been on my mind a lot recently. Here's the thing about Newman that's, I think, particularly interesting, is he's co-opted today and read today in terms of a lot of our theological categories and conflicts. And that makes him actually less illuminating precisely for our time. The key, I think, is to look at Newman within his own framework, understand what he was saying and why, and what audience he was addressing. Now, I want to show this by looking at two major themes in Newman, namely the development of doctrine and the primacy of conscience. Two themes that are often talked about today, but I think in a somewhat distorting way. Now, development of doctrine. Newman does indeed say that doctrine, because it exists in the play of lively minds, develops. It unfolds itself over space and time. Within this epistemological context, he does indeed say, to live is to change, and to be perfect is to have changed often. Now, I can't tell you how many people have run with those quotes or those basic ideas to say that Newman is some kind of freewheeling liberal, that Newman is advocating change for the sake of change. Any sort of change is good. But of course, nothing could be further from the truth. And the best evidence is in the famous Bilietto speech that Newman gave. That's the talk that was customary in those days. When you were named a cardinal, you gave this sort of acceptance speech. And during it, Newman clarified that his whole life had been a constant struggle against liberalism in matters of religion. And by that he meant against the claim that there's no real objective truth, no stable truth in matters of religion. So he's by no means advocating change for the sake of change. See, Newman knew that precisely because ideas unfold, they can unfold positively or negatively. The growth can be an authentic development, that means a showing forth of an implicit truth. Or they can be more like a cancerous outcropping. They can be something that betrays the essence or the very nature of the doctrine. Which is why, furthermore, he called for a living voice of authority, a sort of umpiring voice that could determine the difference between authentic development and corruption. Now, my point here is none of this speaks to the freewheeling, anything goes, change for the sake of change. No, Newman saw an ordered unfolding under the discipline of authority. And actually now, let me put it back into his own time. Newman's main conversation partner, it seems to me, in his treatment of the development of doctrine, was not so much the stuffy conservative. It wasn't the Catholic conservative. His conversation partner was the Protestant, because it was a standard view of the Protestantism of the mid-19th century that a lot of practice and doctrine within Catholicism represented a falling away from biblical purity. And Newman's point was, no, not a falling away, not a corruption, but rather a development of what was given in the Bible. His opponent, if you want, is the advocate of a Protestant antiquarianism. Let's go back to the very beginning. Let's go back to the Bible and the very early decades of the church's life, and that's the truth of it. Newman said, sure, the truth is there implicitly, but it's unfolded itself now over space and time. So I think when we put it in his own context, we see what a sort of subtle and nuanced teaching this was. Okay, the second theme that's often picked up on today is the theme of conscience and the primacy of conscience in Newman. It is indeed true that conscience was a major preoccupation of John Henry Newman. You can see it from beginning to end of his career. It is featured in most of his major writings. It's often the hinge upon which his other teachings turn. So conscience is indeed of central importance. And of course, everyone and his brother cites the famous quip of Newman when he's talking about conscience in relation to the Pope. And he says, if I'm obliged to bring religion into after-dinner toast, I would drink to the Pope, if you please, but to conscience first and the Pope afterwards. Now, as I say, everyone and his brother has tended to run with this as though Newman were flouting papal authority and advocating the exclusive primacy of the individual conscience. It's the individual that decides the purpose of his life, and he's sort of setting aside papal authority. Well, let me give you the clearest indication of why that's the wrong way to read it. Because Newman described the conscience famously as the aboriginal vicar of Christ in the soul. In other words, using the very title of the Pope, the Vicar of Christ, but applying it to the conscience, the more fundamental, the more original Vicar of Christ. The point being, to argue for the primacy of conscience is by no means to argue for a sort of subjectivism or an up to the individualism. You know, it's just a matter of your private decision. No, conscience puts me in touch, Newman thought viscerally so, with a judge, with an authority, with an other who hovers over my life and sanctions it and directs it, rewards it, punishes it. It's by no means the sort of contemporary, I decide the meaning of my life. On the contrary. And notice again, please, aboriginal Vicar of Christ, and then the Vicar of Christ in a sort of formal institutional sense, the Pope. There's no contradiction between the two. On the contrary. They are very much on a spectrum. The conscience being a more interiorly experienced, more viscerally experienced Christ, the aboriginal Vicar of Christ in the soul. And so Newman, as an advocate of sheer moral individualism, couldn't be further from the truth. Okay, having made those clarifications, should I say, okay, well, the conservatives have really read Newman correctly and the liberals are wrong? Well, I would say yes, the sensible conservatives can and should claim that. Newman stood athwart liberalism, as he himself said. But there are those today on the really extreme Catholic right, I think, who are indeed at odds with Newman. In talking about the development of doctrine, he does indeed stand athwart a view that would see doctrine simply as precious objet d'art, under a glass, that they're absolutely unchanging. They're simply passed on from generation to generation. Newman repudiated that view. No, doctrines are living things, and they unfold always true to themselves, never moving into contradiction with themselves, but indeed alive and displaying different aspects and dimensions as they go. Can I give you, by the way, and again, against an extreme Catholic conservatism, Vatican II itself is a very good example of what Newman meant by the development of doctrine. Is Vatican II in continuity with Vatican I, Trent, Chalcedon, and everything else? Yes, absolutely. I affirm with Joseph Ratzinger and with Henri de Lubac and many others, Balthasar, a hermeneutic of continuity. Vatican II represents a continuity with what came before. But at the same time, who could deny that Vatican II represents a development of doctrine? Not simply a repetition of Trent, a repetition of Vatican I, but a true development. You want to see maybe the clearest evidence, look at Lumen Gentium. When dimensions of the Church's teaching on the Church itself emerged that were not present, not clearly taught at Trent or Vatican I. Good. That's a sign of the doctrine living across space and time. How about with conscience now? Are the conservatives simply right about conscience? Well, yeah, I think sensible conservatives are. But Newman felt that the importance of affirming the primacy of conscience is to awaken this visceral sense of a living contact with Christ. So if you want to have, as he would call it, real assent in matters of religion, you should move through the experience of conscience. Now, what that holds off, and I'd say against an extreme conservatism, what that holds off is an excessively legalistic, an excessively objectivistic understanding of the moral life of the Church. No, better, Newman felt that you'd feel it, experience it viscerally through conscience. Now, my point here is where I began. Seeing Newman in his great teachings within the context of his own time and not through the distorting lens of our own conversations today enables us to see, A, what he was teaching, but B, enables Newman to be especially clarifying precisely for our time.